Have you ever wondered what it's like to live in a world where every choice is made for you, where every step you take is dictated by someone else's vision of success? Susan's story takes you on a journey through the highs and lows of a life filled with expectations that aren't her own. But amidst the darkness, there's light in the form of an unexpected ally, a bond stronger than fear, and a glimmer of hope that, even in the most difficult times, love and courage can lead to a brighter future. Stay with us as we explore how one girl's quiet strength and one woman's fierce determination change everything. If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. Every night, the girl would weep quietly, her tears flowing like a river of sorrow once the maid had settled down to sleep. But one fateful night, the maid, sensing something amiss, decided to feign sleep, her heart heavy with an unspoken dread. As she lay there in the darkness, her ears caught the muffled sounds of what the girl's father did when the night cloaked the world in shadows. The revelation struck her like a bolt of lightning, leaving her paralyzed with fear and horror. A sleek, midnight-hued car glided to a halt in front of the imposing entrance of the Moore mansion, its polished surface reflecting the dim lights like a mirror of secrets. Charles Moore, ever the picture of polished success, stepped out with the precision of a man who never leaves anything to chance. He rounded the car with a measured stride, opening the door for his daughter, Susan, whose eyes bore the silent burden of another day spent in a world she didn't choose. "Let's move it, Susan. We don't have all night. Tomorrow's another rehearsal, and you need to be in top form for your modeling," Charles barked, his voice laced with a sharp edge that twisted his concern into something almost menacing. Susan shuffled her feet, the weight of exhaustion slowing her steps, barely managing a nod before Helen, the ever-watchful maid, greeted her at the door with open arms. The embrace Helen offered was more than just a hug, it was a cocoon of warmth and love, a sanctuary in a life where such comforts were scarce. "Oh, my sweet girl, you look so worn out tonight. Come, I'll whip up something special, something to soothe that tired soul of yours," Helen murmured, her voice a balm of kindness in Susan's otherwise cold and demanding world. From a distance, Charles observed, his eyes narrowing as they traced the scene. "Helen, don't forget that Susan's diet is strict. No exceptions today. She has to keep in shape for the judges. It's all for her future," he commanded, his tone brooking no argument, the weight of his authority heavy and unyielding. As she remained nestled in Helen's comforting embrace, Susan whispered, her voice barely a breath in the cavernous entrance hall, "I just wish everything could be different, Helen. I wish I had a choice, a chance to live my own life, to follow my own dreams, to be with Mom." Her words were soaked in a deep yearning for a life not shackled by her father's ambitions, for a reality where her dreams were her own. Helen, guiding Susan gently toward the kitchen, responded in a soft yet resolute whisper, "I know, dear. I know. But remember, the darkest hour comes just before dawn. You have a strength inside you, Susan. A spirit that no stage or judge can ever truly contain. We'll get through this together. You're never alone." Helen's words were more than just comfort, they were a pledge, a solemn vow of unwavering support and protection. Meanwhile, Charles Moore stood rooted in place, his gaze fixed on his daughter and the maid, his mind a storm of rigid expectations and long-buried disappointments. His thoughts churned, a turbulent sea of unfulfilled dreams and relentless drive. "She'll thank me one day," he told himself, clinging to the belief that the path he had carved out for Susan was the only path worth taking. When she's at the top, when she's made a name for herself, all this will be nothing but a distant memory, a small sacrifice on the road to greatness. In the quiet of the night, as the mansion's grand halls echoed with silence, the maid's heart trembled with a fear that was impossible to shake, knowing now the darkness that lingered in the corners of the Moore mansion, threatening to swallow everything she held dear. The kitchen had become a sacred sanctuary, a world that seemed untouched by the heavy demands of the outside. It was a place where Helen and Susan could breathe freely, away from the oppressive weight of Charles's ever-watchful gaze. "Let's see what we can find," Helen said with a playful smile, her hands moving deftly through the cabinets. "Something that won't make your father glare at us, but that'll still light up your face with joy." Her voice was a balm to Susan's frayed nerves, and the promise of a small delight amidst the rigid restrictions of her life brought a fleeting sense of peace. As they prepared a simple salad, Susan's hands moved automatically, her thoughts adrift. She spoke softly, her voice tinged with a sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone her age. "Helen, when I'm on stage, under those blinding lights, it's like I'm slipping further away from who I really am. Each step I take, every forced smile, it feels like I'm performing in a life I never chose." Helen paused, her eyes locking onto Susan's with a depth of understanding that only someone who had seen the world's cruelties could possess. "Susan, darling," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "don't ever lose sight of who you are. No matter how many stages you grace or how dazzling the dresses, none of that defines you. Your spirit, your true essence, is worth more than any crown they could ever place on your head. And I'll be here to remind you of that, always." Their conversation was a stark contrast to the cold silence that filled the rest of the mansion. In that small, humble kitchen, the warmth of human connection created a pocket of light in the midst of the mansion's otherwise icy atmosphere. For a brief, precious moment, the room echoed with the sound of laughter, the kind of laughter that only two souls who understand each other deeply can share. It was a fleeting refuge from the relentless march of Charles's ambitions. As the evening drew to a close, and Susan began to make her way up the grand staircase, a flicker of gratitude warmed her heart. Turning back, she whispered, "Thank you, Helen," for everything. Her voice was soft, almost a breath, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken feelings. The words floated through the air, reaching Helen, who was tidying up the kitchen. Helen's eyes softened, her smile a gentle promise. "Good night, my sweet girl." "Dream with the angels," she replied, her voice laced with an unspoken vow to protect Susan, come what may. The exchange between them was a nightly ritual, but it was so much more than that. It was a testament to the unbreakable bond they shared. It was a silent oath, a strength that would stand against any storm that life might throw their way. With Helen's warmth still lingering in her heart, Susan climbed the stairs, each step echoing the vast loneliness that seemed to seep into every corner of her life. When she reached her room, she closed the door behind her, resting against it for a moment, as if it could somehow hold back the overwhelming feelings pressing down on her. With a heavy sigh, she let herself fall onto the edge of her bed, the weight of the world resting on her slender shoulders. Why is it so hard to accept this life, she thought, her mind swirling with confusion and pain. Being a model, it's supposed to be glamorous, exciting, but it feels like a cage. It's not my happiness, it's my prison. The silence of her room felt suffocating, the walls closing in around her as she stared at the trophies and sashes that littered the shelves, symbols of a life she no longer recognized. They were supposed to represent triumphs, achievements, but to Susan, they were nothing more than reminders of a future she never wanted. "Helen gets it," she whispered into the empty room. "She always understands, but she's the only one who does." A tear slid down her cheek as she added, "If only Mom were here, she would understand. She would save me from this prison." Her words faded into the vast emptiness of the mansion, a place that, despite all its grandeur, felt hollow and cold. The trophies gleamed under the dim light, a cruel reminder of the expectations that trapped her, while the absence of her mother left a void that nothing could fill. In the quiet solitude of her modest room, Helen prepared for bed, but her mind was far from peaceful. Her thoughts were with Susan, the young girl burdened by a life that seemed to drain her of her spirit. "She has so much promise, so much light in her soul," Helen mused, her heart heavy with concern. But that brilliance is being dimmed day by day, suffocated by the expectations of a father who either doesn't see or refuses to acknowledge it. Susan needs to breathe, to grow, to be free to discover who she truly is, not just the version they're forcing her to become. Even as the darkness of the room enveloped her, Helen felt a rising determination within her, a quiet yet unwavering vow to do more for the girl she had come to care for so deeply. As the night deepened, a heavy silence blanketed the mansion, as if the house itself was holding its breath. But within that stillness, faint, muffled sobs drifted through the corridors, a sad, haunting melody that broke through the quiet. It was the sound of Susan's heartache, seeping through the walls like a whispered cry for help. In her bed, Helen tossed and turned, restless and uneasy. The distant sound of Susan's crying echoed in her ears, pulling at her heartstrings. "They're just dreams," she tried to tell herself, clinging to the thin thread of denial. "Just reflections of my own fears and worries about her." Susan is fine, but deep within her, a voice whispered the truth she didn't want to face. Those cries were real, and they were the echoes of a reality she desperately wished she could change. As dawn broke, the soft, golden light of the sun crept through the mansion's long, shadowy corridors, heralding the arrival of a new day. But even as the morning light brought warmth to the cold walls, the echoes of the previous night lingered, haunting the silent halls. Helen was the first to rise, as always, moving through the house with the quiet grace of someone used to making herself unseen. She began to prepare breakfast, her hands working with practiced efficiency, though her mind was still clouded with worry. Upstairs, Susan stirred as the first rays of sunlight brushed against her tear-streaked face. Slowly, she got out of bed and made her way to the mirror, staring at her own reflection with weary eyes. "Today is a new day," she whispered to herself, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. She tried to infuse her words with strength, but they felt hollow, like a mantra she no longer believed in. "I need to be strong," she continued, "for myself, for Mom, and even for Helen, who seems to believe in me more than I believe in myself." With a deep breath, Susan descended the grand staircase, following the comforting scent that wafted from the kitchen. Her steps were slow, weighed down by the sleepless night, but as she neared the familiar warmth of Helen's domain, her heart felt a tiny bit lighter. When she saw Helen bustling about, a small smile found its way to her lips. "Good morning, Helen. It looks like you've already started working your magic in here," Susan said, her voice soft but tinged with a hint of gratitude. Helen turned to face her, her smile warm and inviting, filled with a quiet reassurance that Susan had come to depend on. "Good morning, my dear. Today I thought we'd make something a little special for breakfast," she said, her tone light and cheerful, as if to chase away the shadows that lingered from the night before. "How about pancakes with honey and fresh fruit? It's Saturday, after all, time to relax and recharge our spirits." The inviting aroma and Helen's comforting presence began to lift the heavy fog that had settled in Susan's heart. For a moment, in that cozy kitchen filled with the promise of a new day, the weight of her troubles seemed to ease just a little. The bond between them, unspoken yet unbreakable, was a lifeline that Susan clung to, even as the world outside continued to demand more than she was ready to give. Helen's suggestion wasn't merely about breakfast, it was a tender offering of comfort, an attempt to weave a thread of joy into the tightly controlled fabric of Susan's life. As Susan settled at the kitchen table, she watched Helen's practiced movements with a soft smile. "You always know how to make things better, Helen." "I'm really grateful for that," Susan murmured, her words laden with sincerity. It wasn't just idle chatter, it was a quiet confession of the deep appreciation she felt for the woman who brought warmth and light into her otherwise rigid existence. As they enjoyed their meal, the conversation flowed effortlessly, from simple weekend plans to whispered dreams and hidden desires. Helen listened with unwavering attention, gently encouraging Susan to voice the thoughts that she often kept buried beneath her father's demanding expectations. The kitchen became a safe haven where Susan could be herself, where the weight of her father's ambitions seemed to momentarily lift, allowing her to breathe freely. The morning drifted away, and by the time the clock struck noon, Charles Moore entered the room, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere. The light, carefree energy that had surrounded Susan and Helen began to shift, replaced by a tension that hung heavily in the air. Helen, ever observant, remained on high alert, ready to step in and diffuse any potential conflict before it could escalate. Lunch began with the usual pleasantries, the conversation hovering around trivial topics, but the unspoken weight of unaddressed emotions lingered beneath the surface. Encouraged by Helen's quiet support, Susan decided to broach a subject that had long been ignored. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling but resolute, "I've been thinking about Mom. Could we visit her soon? I really miss her." There was a vulnerability in her words, a longing for a connection that had been severed far too long. Charles Moore's response was swift and cold. He snatched his napkin with a force that startled both Susan and Helen, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Susan, we've already talked about this. It's not appropriate to bring your mother into this conversation. You have everything you need here. Thinking about her only distracts you from what really matters." His tone left no room for debate, his words slamming the door shut on any possibility of further discussion. Susan's face fell, her eyes dropping to her plate as she silently absorbed the reprimand. The hope she had dared to let flicker was quickly extinguished. Helen's heart ached at the sight, a deep, maternal instinct urging her to defend the girl, to remind Charles of the irreplaceable bond between a mother and her child. But she knew her place in the household, knew the unspoken rules that governed her role. Despite her urge to speak, she remained silent, her hands clenching into fists beneath the table as she struggled against the helplessness she felt. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken words, and Charles wasted no time in redirecting the conversation back to more familiar territory: Susan's duties and the relentless expectations that he had set for her. His gaze swept across the table like a commanding officer inspecting his troops, finally landing on Susan with a calculated intensity. "Now, about your schedule," he began, his voice a blend of concern and rigid authority. "We have a full day of preparation ahead for the upcoming fashion show. And Susan, we need to have a serious discussion about your eating habits and your personal grooming. You've been overeating again. And your hair is looking dry. We can't afford to let your image slip. It has to be perfect at all times." His words, though laced with a veneer of concern, carried the weight of judgment. They hung over Susan like a shadow, another layer of pressure added to the already overwhelming burden she carried. Helen's chest tightened as she watched Susan nod in silent submission. The spark of hope that had briefly flared now dimmed once more. The unyielding expectations, the relentless drive for perfection, it was a prison that Helen longed to help Susan escape, but for now, all she could do was offer her quiet support, hoping that somehow it would be enough to keep the girl's spirit from breaking entirely. Susan, feeling as though each of her father's words had piled like heavy stones in her pockets, dropped her gaze to her untouched plate. Inside, a tempest of unspoken responses swirled, each one demanding to be voiced, but the harsh reality of her situation silenced them all. She knew better than to provoke an argument with her father, knew that defiance would only lead to more lectures, more control. So, she chose the safer path, the path of submission. "Understood, Dad. I'll try harder," she whispered, her voice so faint that it barely rose above the clinking of silverware, a quiet surrender that disguised her yearning for freedom, for the chance to live as her true self. Helen, observing this exchange from her place at the table, felt a surge of indignation coupled with a deep sense of helplessness. In her heart, a fierce desire to protect Susan burned brightly, a longing to shield her from the relentless cycle of criticism and impossible expectations that seemed to define her life. Why can't he see it? Helen thought, her mind racing with frustration. Why can't he see the damage he's causing? Susan is so vibrant, so full of potential, but all he sees are flaws, things to fix, instead of the beautiful soul she truly is. But what can I do? How can I help her realize her own worth? The meal concluded in an atmosphere heavy with unspoken tension, each person lost in their own world of worries. Charles was the first to rise, his mind already consumed with schedules and plans, leaving behind a cloud of lingering expectations as he made his way to the living room. After he left, Helen approached Susan, who remained seated, staring off into the distance, as if caught in a web of thoughts too complex to untangle. With the gentleness of someone who knew how fragile moments like these could be, Helen sat beside her, ready to address the topic that had been weighing heavily on both their hearts. Susan, Helen began softly, her voice filled with concern. When you mentioned your mother today, I noticed something in your eyes, something more than just missing her. Your mother, Dorothy. She must be very special to you, isn't she? Helen's words were a careful invitation, a way of opening a door for Susan to share the thoughts and emotions she had kept hidden for so long. Susan looked up at Helen, surprise flickering in her eyes, followed quickly by relief. It was as though someone had finally seen the depth of her struggle, and she was grateful to have someone willing to listen. Yes, Helen, she is, Susan confessed, her voice growing steadier as she spoke. I think about her every day. But my father, he doesn't like to talk about her, as you saw. After they separated, he told me it was better for me to stay with him, that he had the resources and the knowledge to give me a better future. The words flowed more easily than she had anticipated, the safety that Helen provided unlocking a dam of pent-up emotions. Helen listened intently, her expression one of understanding and compassion. She nodded thoughtfully, allowing Susan to see that every word was being absorbed with genuine care. I understand, dear. It's a complicated situation, but I'm curious. How did your mother, Dorothy, feel about all this? About you staying with your father? Helen's question wasn't just out of curiosity, it was a way to dig deeper, to uncover the roots of the pain that Susan carried, and perhaps, in doing so, find a way to help her navigate the difficult emotions that seemed to tether her to a life that wasn't her own. Susan hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering with a mixture of sorrow and contemplation as she thought back to the conversation she had shared with her mother. She didn't want to let me go, Susan admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom loved me so much, and she wanted me to stay with her, but Dad convinced me that his way was better. He told me I'd have more opportunities with him, that I'd be successful if I followed his path. But I don't know anymore, Helen. I don't know if that success is worth losing who I am. Helen's heart ached as she heard the doubt and confusion in Susan's voice. She reached out, gently placing a hand on the young girl's arm. It's never too late to find yourself again, Susan, she said softly, her voice a beacon of hope. Your mother's love is still there, and so is your own strength. You may feel lost now, but I believe in you. I believe you'll find your way back to the life that truly makes you happy, not the one others expect you to live. Helen's words hung in the air, a silent promise that no matter how difficult the journey ahead, she would be there by Susan's side, helping her reclaim her light. Susan sighed, her shoulders sagging under the weight of her memories. My mother. She was devastated, Helen. But back then, she didn't have much of a choice. My father had more money, more resources, and she was still trying to rebuild her life after the separation. She told me it was temporary, that we'd be together again soon. But that day never came. It's been years now. Ever since I was 16, Susan's voice was filled with a deep sadness, a sorrow that came from the painful realization of an unfulfilled promise, a hope that had slowly withered over time. Helen reached out, gently taking Susan's hand in hers, offering silent comfort through the warmth of her touch. Susan. She began softly, her voice filled with compassion. I have no doubt that your mother loves you. And maybe, just maybe, there's still a way to reclaim that lost time. Life has a way of surprising us. And love has a remarkable ability to find its way through the cracks. Perhaps it's time we start thinking about how to make that reunion a reality. Helen's words were more than just an attempt to soothe, they were a promise, a pledge of unwavering support. She would stand by Susan, helping her find the path that could lead her back to her mother's embrace. The conversation continued, each word spoken weaving a delicate thread of hope into the fabric of Susan's heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, Susan began to feel that she wasn't entirely alone on this difficult journey. With Helen by her side, perhaps, just perhaps, there was a chance that she could find her way back to the mother she had longed for all these years. After an emotionally charged exchange, reality reasserted itself, and it was time for Susan to prepare for the day's activities with her father. Helen watched as Susan gathered her things, noticing the conflicting emotions etched on the young girl's face, a blend of resignation and determination. "Helen, thank you," Susan said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't even know how to just thank you." She stumbled over her words, the depth of her gratitude almost too overwhelming to express fully. Helen smiled warmly, nodding in understanding. "You never need to thank me, dear. Remember, I'm here for you, always. And let's keep thinking about what we talked about, all right? Everything will work out, you'll see," she replied, trying to fill her words with optimism, though her heart ached at the thought of Susan walking out the door to face another day under her father's demanding expectations. Just then, Charles's voice rang out from outside, breaking the moment between them. "Susan, we're running late. Let's go." The commanding tone left little room for delay. Susan turned to Helen, their eyes meeting in a final shared look of understanding before she headed toward the door, moving toward her father's call. Helen remained behind, standing alone in the quiet room, her mind racing with thoughts and worries. She watched Susan disappear down the hall, and as the door closed behind her, Helen silently vowed to herself that she would do whatever she could to help Susan find her way back to the happiness she deserved, no matter how long it took. As the door closed behind Susan and Charles, Helen took a deep breath, turning her focus to the house. There were always tasks to be done: cleaning, organizing, preparing for the next day's demands, but today, her hands moved mechanically, while her mind wandered far from the mundane chores. As she dusted the dining room table, a light idea began to form. "Maybe I could find a way for Susan to spend more time in the garden," she mused aloud. "She always seems lighter, more herself, when she's out there, away from all the pressure." The thought brought a fleeting smile to her face, but as quickly as it came, doubt followed. But Charles, he'd probably see it as a distraction, something that pulls her away from what he considers important. No, it wouldn't be enough. As she folded Susan's clothes, an ordinary task that now felt charged with meaning, another idea crept into her mind. What if I talked to Charles, tried to explain how much Susan needs more freedom, maybe even suggest she could visit Dorothy? For a moment, the idea seemed hopeful, but just as swiftly, Helen's hope was dashed by reality. She sighed, frustrated. "Who am I to him? Just a maid. He would never listen to me, especially when it comes to how to raise his own daughter." Throughout the day, as Helen moved from task to task, her mind kept circling back to Susan, each new idea accompanied by the same familiar doubts. "What if I start small?" she pondered while arranging the linens. "Perhaps I could suggest that Susan pick out her own outfits for the fashion shows, something that would give her a sense of control." But again, reality intruded, and Helen frowned. "Charles would probably dismiss me. He'd say I don't understand the world of fashion competitions, and truthfully, he wouldn't be wrong." At one point, while tidying Mr. Moore's office, Helen came across a stack of documents. They seemed ordinary at first, but one particular paper caught her eye. It had Dorothy's name on it, along with an address. Helen's heart raced as she picked it up, her fingers trembling slightly as she read it. It was Dorothy's current address, the location of Susan's mother. Helen glanced around, ensuring she was alone, before carefully writing down the information on a small piece of paper. "I might need this someday," she thought, tucking the paper into her pocket, her mind already racing with the possibilities of what this newfound knowledge could mean. As the day wore on and the chores were completed, Helen found herself sitting alone in the quiet kitchen, a cup of tea warming her hands. The house, so full of tension and expectations during the day, now felt eerily empty. She sipped her tea slowly, her thoughts swirling around the fragile plans she had formed throughout the day. Each one, though full of good intentions, felt flimsy against the harsh reality of the situation. There were so many potential failures, so many obstacles that made her question whether anything she did could truly make a difference. The weight of it all pressed down on her, and she couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had begun to creep into her heart. "Am I just fooling myself?" Helen whispered into the silence, her voice barely audible. The sense of helplessness gnawed at her, growing with each passing moment. Maybe there's nothing I can do. Maybe I'm just holding on to hope where there are no real solutions. The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with uncertainty, as Helen stared into the depths of her tea, searching for answers that remained stubbornly out of reach. And yet, despite the doubts, she couldn't completely extinguish the flicker of determination that remained within her. Maybe the road ahead was full of obstacles, but Helen wasn't ready to give up, not yet. There had to be a way, some path that could lead Susan to the happiness and freedom she deserved. And yet, despite the doubts and uncertainty gnawing at her, Helen knew she couldn't simply give up. For Susan, she would keep trying no matter how impossible each plan seemed. The alternative, watching Susan slowly wither under the weight of her father's expectations, was something Helen refused to accept. After Susan's quiet departure, a heavy atmosphere settled over the mansion. The memory of the muffled crying that Helen had dismissed as a dream echoed in her mind. What if it wasn't a dream? What if Susan really does need me, and I've been fooling myself into thinking it's just my imagination? She wondered, a deep sense of responsibility washing over her, one that went far beyond her usual duties. Determined not to let sleep claim her too easily that night, Helen resolved to stay awake, vigilant for any signs of distress from upstairs. As the house fell into a stillness that only the dead of night could bring, Helen remained alert, her ears straining for any sounds. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe Susan's fine, she's just tired, she whispered to herself, desperately trying to quell the unease creeping into her thoughts. But the deceptive calm was soon shattered by the distant sound of raised voices. A heated argument, muffled yet unmistakable, began to drift down the hall. Though the words were hard to make out, the tension in the voices was unmistakable. This isn't right, Helen thought, her heart tightening with growing anxiety. Confrontations between Charles and Susan weren't uncommon, but something about the intensity of this exchange alarmed her in a way that felt different, more urgent. Without a second thought, Helen rose from her chair, her movements instinctively quiet as she made her way toward the stairs. Years of navigating the mansion in near silence had made her footsteps light and soundless, an unspoken skill she now relied on as she crept closer to Susan's room. "I'll just check, just to make sure Susan's okay," she reasoned, knowing full well that she was crossing a line violating the unspoken rules of privacy and hierarchy that governed the household. But her concern for Susan outweighed any fear of reprimand. As Helen neared Susan's room, the sound of crying became clearer, more desperate, and it pierced through Helen's heart like a dagger. "Oh, Susan," she thought, her mind racing with worry. "How can I help you? How can I help you? How can I protect you if I don't even fully understand what you're going through?" Helen wrestled with her conflicting emotions, torn between the impulse to intervene and the knowledge of her limitations as a mere maid in the Moore household. Standing outside Susan's bedroom door, Helen hesitated, her hand hovering near the handle. If I go in now, what will Charles say? And how would Susan feel? Knowing I heard everything, she questioned herself, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But the sound of Susan's sobs, mingled with the angry tones of her father's voice, made it impossible to turn away. Each word, though faint through the thick door, felt like a blade cutting into Helen's heart. The argument, which had initially seemed distant and indistinct, began to reveal itself in all its harshness. Charles's voice was sharp, commanding, filled with frustration and impatience, while Susan's was soft, broken by sobs, her pain evident in every word she tried to speak. Helen stood frozen, torn between her fear of overstepping and her overwhelming need to do something, anything to help Susan. The internal battle raging within her mirrored the turmoil on the other side of the door. Each passing second felt like an eternity as Helen remained there, caught between her duty to remain silent and her fierce protective instinct that urged her to act. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest, as she wrestled with the knowledge that whatever she chose, it would have consequences. "I can't take this anymore, Dad. I've had enough." Susan's voice broke through the oppressive silence like a dam bursting, her words overflowing with despair and frustration that had been building for years. "I don't want to be a model. I don't like it, never did, and I never will." The raw emotion in her voice shattered the wall of authority Charles had so carefully constructed. Charles's response came swiftly, his voice booming with the same unyielding force he had always used to control every aspect of Susan's life. "You don't understand, Susan. This is for your own good. The rehearsals, the shows, the diets, all of this is necessary. You need this to be someone, to have a future." His words were more like commands than advice, each syllable dripping with a sense of inevitability, as if there was no other path for her to take. "But I'm unhappy, Dad." Susan's voice cracked with the weight of her pain, tears choking her words. "This is killing me inside. It's not the life I want. You've been pushing this on me for so long, and I'm tired." Her anguish filled the room, a palpable force that seemed to bounce off the walls and echo back at her. She wasn't just fighting for a different life, she was fighting for her very soul. Charles, however, remained unmoved, his tone growing colder, more menacing. "If you don't follow what I'm saying, I'll have to take more drastic measures. I'll reduce your food intake even further, and I'll cut off any contact with the outside world. You need to learn discipline, Susan, even if I have to force you to do it." His words were chilling in their detachment, as though he saw his daughter not as a person, but as a project, a thing to be perfected at any cost. "You can't do this to me." Susan's voice rose in desperation, her defiance laced with heartbreak. "This is abuse, Dad. I wish Mom were here. She would never have allowed this." Her final plea was a cry for help, a desperate yearning for the protection and love she had been denied for so long. It was a last-ditch effort to reclaim her life, to be seen and heard as more than just a pawn in her father's plans. Outside the door, Helen's heart pounded in her chest, her hands trembling as she pressed them against the cool wood. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. Charles's cruel words, Susan's desperate cries, they painted a picture far darker than anything she had ever imagined. It wasn't just about strict rules or high expectations anymore. This was something far more sinister. This was abuse, plain and simple, and it was happening right under her nose. This can't go on, Helen thought, the realization hitting her with the force of a tidal wave. The urgency of the situation overwhelmed her, drowning out any fear or hesitation she might have felt. "I have to do something. I can't just stand by and let this happen." The decision took root in her heart like a flame, growing brighter and stronger with each passing second. Helen knew that intervening meant stepping far beyond the bounds of her role as a maid, but Susan's cries had ignited a fire within her that couldn't be extinguished. She would find a way to protect Susan, no matter the cost. Helen's feet pounded down the stairs, each step echoing in the oppressive silence of the mansion. Her heart raced, not just from the physical exertion, but from the gravity of what she was about to do. She knew that this decision, this one, irreversible action, could change everything. Yet the image of Susan's tear-streaked face, her voice pleading for a life she could call her own, was all the courage Helen needed. She reached the landline phone, her hands trembling as she dialed the familiar emergency number. With a deep breath, she steadied herself. "Police, please, it's an emergency," she said the moment the call connected, her voice firm despite the whirlwind of emotions threatening to consume her. Helen knew that by making this call, she was crossing a line from which there would be no return. But the conviction that she was doing the right thing, that this was the only way to protect Susan, filled her with an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. Holding the phone tightly, she took another breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she spoke. "I need help. There's a situation here where I believe a child is in danger. Please send a patrol car quickly." The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, professional, but laced with concern. "What exactly is going on, ma'am? We need more information before we can send one of our units. Please provide as many details as possible." Helen swallowed hard, her mind racing to organize her thoughts. It's the daughter of the house owner. He's extremely strict with her, forcing her into a career she doesn't want, controlling every aspect of her life, what she eats, how she lives. I just overheard a very intense argument. He was making threats. Someone needs to come here and check on her. Please. Understood, ma'am. We'll send a team right away. Stay safe and try not to intervene until we arrive, okay? I need you to stay at the location if possible, the dispatcher instructed, offering not just guidance but also a sense of reassurance, a promise that help was on the way. As Helen hung up the phone, a flood of mixed emotions surged through her. Relief, yes, but also a gnawing anxiety. She had done the right thing, she was sure of it, but now came the hardest part, the wait. The next 30 minutes stretched into an eternity, each second ticking by with excruciating slowness as she imagined all the possible consequences of her actions. What if Charles reacted violently? What if the police didn't believe her? Doubt gnawed at her, but beneath it all, the certainty remained Susan needed help, and Helen had done what she could to get it. When the police finally arrived, Helen hurried to meet them at the entrance, her heart still racing. "Please, come in," she urged, her voice a mix of urgency and relief. "It's about Mr. Moore and his daughter, Susan. I've been concerned for a while now, and I knew I had to talk to someone about what's been happening. I'm hoping you can help." One of the officers, a man with a strong yet reassuring presence, nodded as he listened to Helen's account. His eyes were kind but focused, understanding the seriousness of the situation. "We'll need to speak with Mr. Moore," he said, his tone leaving no room for refusal. Charles appeared from down the hall, his expression a blend of surprise and irritation. He hadn't expected this, a visit from the police at his door. But perhaps deep down, he had known something like this was inevitable. As he approached, Helen watched from a distance, her heart in her throat, hoping against hope that Susan would finally get the help she so desperately needed. "Mr. Moore," the officer began, his voice calm but firm, "we need to talk about some concerns raised by your maid regarding the treatment of your daughter." Charles's face hardened, a mix of disbelief and indignation flashing across his features. He opened his mouth to speak, but the officer's steady gaze silenced him. Helen stood back, her breath held as the scene unfolded. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that this confrontation was just the beginning. But she also knew that for the first time, Susan's voice was being heard by someone who could truly make a difference. And for Helen, that was enough. In her room, far from the tension and voices downstairs, Susan sought refuge in her memories. She closed her eyes and let herself drift back to a time when life was simpler, filled with warmth and love. She remembered a specific day with her mother, Dorothy, before everything had changed, before the separation, before the modeling, before the suffocating control. It was a day that stood out in her mind like a beacon, a moment of pure happiness and freedom. They had spent the afternoon in the park, laughing as they fed the ducks, her mother's laughter like music, a sound that Susan hadn't heard in so long. That memory felt like another lifetime now, a world she could only visit in her dreams. Downstairs, the police were finishing their assessment of the situation. After speaking with Charles, the officers requested a brief statement from Helen. With a heavy heart, she approached them, hoping that her words would carry enough weight to make a difference. "Officers, I just want the best for Susan," she began, her voice steady but filled with a deep, protective concern. "She's a sweet, intelligent girl, but she's being forced into a life she didn't choose. She's suffering, and I'm worried about what this will do to her if nothing changes." One of the officers, a man with kind eyes, nodded as he listened, his expression sympathetic. "We understand your concern, ma'am. We'll document everything you've said, but without concrete evidence or Susan's own statement confirming these allegations, our ability to intervene is limited." He explained, his tone carrying the weight of professional empathy for a situation that was all too common, where the law often fell short of providing immediate protection. Helen had expected this, but hearing the words out loud still sent a wave of desolation crashing over her. "So there's nothing you can do at this moment? Is that what you're telling me?" she asked, her voice laced with a desperate plea, clinging to the last glimmer of hope that someone, anyone, could help. The other officer, with a firm but gentle tone, added, "For now, no. We are taking Mr. Moore to the station for questioning, but unless we have solid evidence or another witness comes forward, he'll likely be released soon. But please know that we're here if the situation changes." If anything else comes to light, his unfinished sentence was a silent invitation for Helen to stay vigilant, to keep the lines of communication open. With a heart weighed down by the conversation, Helen returned inside the mansion. She found Susan anxiously awaiting news, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Helen sighed, the sound heavy with the burden of the truth she had to share. "Susan," she began softly, sitting down beside the young girl, "they said they can't do anything right now. My statement alone, just being the maid, isn't enough. And without proof, there's not much that can be done at this moment." The words seemed to hit Susan like a physical blow. Her eyes filled with tears that she had been holding back, and her shoulders slumped in defeat. The hope that had flickered briefly was snuffed out by the cold reality of their situation. "So, we're alone in this," she whispered, more to herself than to Helen, her voice barely audible as the weight of her circumstances closed in around her like a suffocating fog. Helen reached out, pulling Susan into a gentle embrace. "You're not alone," she whispered, though the words felt hollow in the face of the overwhelming helplessness they both felt. Helen could only hold on to the hope that, despite the limitations, they could find a way forward together. Together, Helen and Susan spent the rest of the night in a shared silence that spoke louder than words, their grief forming an unspoken bond. Despite the despair that weighed heavily on them, the night wasn't over when Charles Moore returned from the police station. His face was a mask of controlled fury, the rage beneath barely contained. Without hesitation, he turned to Helen, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "You're fired. Pack your things and leave my house," he ordered, his words as biting as the wind beginning to whip outside. Helen's heart clenched at the sudden finality of it all. Though shocked by the abrupt dismissal, she knew in her heart that her attempt to protect Susan had sealed her fate in this household. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. With her dignity intact, Helen moved through the house one last time, gathering her belongings, each piece a small reminder of the years she had devoted to this family, years that had now ended with an act of bravery she would never regret. As Charles unceremoniously tossed her bags out into the cold, rain-soaked night, Helen shivered, feeling the chill seep into her bones. But the cold on her skin was nothing compared to the ache in her heart. She turned one last time toward the house, the place she had come to know so well, and whispered a promise to Susan. "I'm sorry, Susan. I promise I'll do what I can from out here for you." With those final words lingering in the air, Helen walked away from the Moore mansion, the rain mingling with her sadness, washing the streets but not the heaviness in her heart. As she distanced herself from the imposing structure that had once been her world, her thoughts remained on Susan. What would happen to her now, left behind in that oppressive house? Helen could only hope that somehow, some way, Susan would find her path to freedom and happiness, far from the shadow of the life being forced upon her. After what felt like an eternity, Helen found refuge in her small apartment. It was a modest place, far from the grandeur of the Moore mansion, but it offered a quiet solace that was a welcome contrast to the suffocating tension she had just left behind. As she finally laid down, exhaustion pulled at her, but her mind refused to quiet. Instead, it raced with thoughts of what she could do next, how she could continue to protect Susan, even from a distance. And then, like a beacon of hope in the darkness, the idea of contacting Dorothy, Susan's mother, emerged. Maybe Dorothy can help. Maybe she doesn't know how much Susan is suffering, Helen thought, her mind spinning with possibilities. She turned over in bed, the determination to reach out growing stronger as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains. When morning finally broke, Helen rose with a renewed sense of purpose. She rummaged through her things until she found the crumpled piece of paper tucked away in the pocket of her pants, the address she had written down days ago. It was a reminder of a time when contacting Dorothy had seemed like a distant possibility, something to consider only in the most extreme circumstances. Now it felt like the only option. With the address in hand and her heart heavy with worry but light with newfound hope, Helen hailed a taxi. She didn't know what would come next, but she was certain of one thing: she wouldn't give up on Susan. She couldn't. As the taxi pulled away from her apartment, taking her toward Dorothy's address, Helen's resolve only strengthened. This was just the beginning of a new chapter, and she would fight with everything she had to ensure Susan found the happiness and freedom she deserved. The journey to Dorothy's city was filled with tension, each mile bringing Helen closer to the confrontation she hoped would change Susan's future. As the taxi neared its destination, Dorothy's house came into view, a home that, though large, had a humble charm to it. The modest structure seemed to echo the warmth and simplicity that Susan had once described to Helen, a place that, despite its age, held a quiet beauty and the comfort of memories lived within its walls. Stepping out of the taxi, Helen's heart pounded in her chest. She stood at the entrance, momentarily doubting herself. Is this the right thing to do, she wondered, but then Susan's face flashed in her mind. The pain, the tears, and any hesitation evaporated. For Susan, she whispered, repeating it like a mantra, drawing strength from the thought. Standing before Dorothy's door, Helen took a deep breath to steady herself. She knew the next few moments could define Susan's future, and the weight of that realization bore down on her like never before. With trembling hands, she raised her arm and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet morning air and through Helen's own anxious heart. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing Dorothy. Her initial surprise quickly gave way to cautious curiosity as she saw Helen, a stranger, standing on her doorstep. "Can I help you?" Dorothy asked, her voice soft but carrying the underlying strength of a woman who had weathered many storms. Her eyes, though kind, held a guarded uncertainty. "My name is Helen. I used to work for Charles, Susan's father. I need to talk to you about your daughter. It's very important, and it can't wait another second. I believe she may be in danger," Helen said, her voice steady but filled with urgency, each word conveying the gravity of her visit. Dorothy's expression shifted immediately, concern etching itself into her features. She stepped back, gesturing for Helen to come inside. "Please come in." "What's happened to Susan?" she asked, her voice tinged with the worry that only a mother could feel. She led Helen into the living room, a space that radiated warmth and comfort, a stark contrast to the cold grandeur of the Moore mansion. The simplicity of Dorothy's home spoke of love and care, reflecting the very nature of the woman who lived there. Once seated, Helen took a moment to collect her thoughts, then began to speak, her words filled with conviction and concern. "Susan is suffering, Dorothy. Charles is forcing her into a modeling career, something she clearly hates. He controls every aspect of her life, from what she eats to who she can talk to. I overheard a terrible argument last night. He threatened to cut her food and take even more extreme measures. Susan is desperate, and I fear for her well-being. Dorothy's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her hands trembling in her lap. I knew Charles was strict, but I never imagined it had come to this. I always feared Susan would become trapped in the life he wanted for her, but I had no idea it was this severe. She said, her voice cracking with the weight of her guilt and sorrow. The pain of not having been there for her daughter, of being kept at a distance by circumstances beyond her control, was evident in every word she spoke. Helen reached out, gently taking Dorothy's hand. You can help her, Dorothy. You're her mother. She needs you now more than ever. I know things haven't been easy between you and Charles, but Susan needs a way out, and I believe you're the only one who can give that to her. Dorothy nodded through her tears, her resolve hardening. I won't let her suffer like this. I'll do whatever it takes to bring her back home, to give her the life she deserves. Her words were spoken with the fierce determination of a mother who had been absent for too long and was now ready to fight for her child's happiness. The two women sat in silence for a moment, each lost in thought, but united in purpose. Helen had taken the first step, and now, together, she and Dorothy would do whatever it took to free Susan from the life that had been forced upon her. Helen squeezed Dorothy's hand, offering her strength. I know this is hard, but together we can give Susan the life she deserves. Your voice as her mother holds power. If you're willing to speak out, to testify about what Charles has done, we can protect her. Helen said, her gaze locked with Dorothy's, her determination unwavering. Dorothy, still visibly shaken by the situation, nodded with growing resolve. You're right, Helen. I've been absent too long. I can't let this continue. I'll give my testimony. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Susan, to free her from that life, Dorothy affirmed, her voice gaining strength. The natural kindness in her tone was now underscored by a fierce courage, one that only a mother determined to fight for her child could possess. Without hesitation, Dorothy picked up the phone, her hand steady as she dialed the number for the police station in Charles's city. Hello, my name is Dorothy Moore. I'm Susan Moore's mother, and I need to give a statement about her father, Charles Moore. It's urgent, she said firmly when the call connected. Each word was spoken with clarity and purpose, leaving no doubt about her intent. After the decisive call, Dorothy and Helen quickly made their way to the police station, their hearts heavy with a mixture of anxiety and determination. As they approached their destination, each step brought them closer to a confrontation that could change everything. Meanwhile, back at the Moore mansion, Charles sat alone in his office, grappling with the reality of the situation spiraling out of his control. The recent events replayed in his mind like a relentless storm. If Dorothy finds out, if she fights for custody, if the police start believing these ridiculous accusations, I can't let that happen. Susan is my responsibility. I know what's best for her, he told himself, clinging to the belief that his actions were justified, no matter how extreme they seemed to others. In his growing desperation, a new idea began to take root in his mind, a drastic solution to the problem at hand. If we just disappear for a while, until all of this blows over. Yes, that could work, he concluded, the twisted logic reflecting the chaotic state of his emotions. Charles convinced himself that this was the best course of action, that it was the only way to protect Susan from what he saw as an unjust world trying to tear them apart. Without wasting any time, Charles found Susan. He told her they needed to leave on a sudden trip, his tone leaving no room for questions. It's for your own good, Susan. Trust me. I'm your father, and I only want what's best for you, he insisted, guiding his confused and reluctant daughter to the car. Susan's instincts screamed that something was wrong, but years of conditioned obedience kept her silent. Back at the police station, Dorothy sat down to give her testimony. Her words were measured but resolute, each one carefully chosen to paint a clear picture of what Susan had been enduring. Charles has always been controlling, but I never imagined it would come to this. Our daughter doesn't deserve this life living under constant pressure and unhappiness. She deserves to be free, to choose her own path, Dorothy explained, her voice trembling with a mix of pain and determination. The officers listened intently, noting every detail. One of them leaned forward, his expression serious but supportive. "Your testimony could make all the difference, Dorothy. We'll do everything in our power to ensure Susan's safety," he assured her, recognizing the courage it took for her to confront this situation. A patrol car was immediately dispatched to Charles's house, but when the officers arrived, the mansion was empty. The tension in the air thickened as they realized the situation might have escalated. Suspecting that Charles might be fleeing with Susan, the officers fanned out, searching the streets for any sign of his vehicle. Then, just as the unease reached its peak, a patrol car spotted a vehicle matching the description of Charles's car. Moving with caution, the officers began to follow at a safe distance, keeping a close eye on any suspicious movements. Inside the car, Charles was focused on his plan, unaware that the walls were slowly closing in around him. As the officers followed, they prepared for the moment that could change the course of everything for Susan, for Dorothy, and for Helen, who had set all of this in motion. Inside the car, Susan's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and confusion. The suddenness of their departure, the tension in her father's voice, it all felt wrong. "Where are we going, Dad? What's happening? I just want to know why we're leaving so quickly," she asked, her voice trembling, betraying the anxiety she tried to contain. Charles glanced at her briefly, struggling to keep his composure despite the storm raging inside him. "Everything is under control, Susan. We just need some time away. That's all until things calm down," he replied, though his words felt hollow. His mind raced with thoughts of how this would all play out, the consequences of his actions, and how Dorothy might react if she found out. Despite his outward calm, the weight of losing control gnawed at him. Unbeknownst to Charles, a police patrol had been quietly trailing them, their careful pursuit now reaching a critical point. As the tension mounted, the officers decided to make their move. The patrol car's siren pierced the air, forcing Charles to pull over. His pulse quickened as the officers approached cautiously, their stance professional yet wary. One officer, his voice firm and authoritative, called out, "Mr. Moore, please step out of the car with your hands where we can see them." The words sliced through the tense silence, signaling that there was no turning back. Charles, his face a mix of frustration and desperation, obeyed. As he was led out of the car, a sinking feeling of defeat settled over him. This can't be happening, he thought, struggling to reconcile the events unfolding around him. Everything I did was for Susan's future. Why can't they see that? But now, confronted with the consequences of his actions, the justifications he had clung to felt increasingly hollow. Susan, now separated from her father and placed in a different police car, was lost in her own thoughts. The whirlwind of emotions, fear, uncertainty, and a faint glimmer of hope swirled within her. What's going to happen now? Does this mean things will change? She wondered. I just wish Mom were here. When they arrived at the police station, Susan's breath caught in her throat as she saw Dorothy and Helen waiting for her. The flood of emotions was too much to hold back. She ran toward them, her words tumbling out in a rush, trying to express everything she had felt in those terrifying moments. "Mom, Helen, I was so scared. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if you would know where I was. I didn't know if I would see you again," she cried, the relief and gratitude pouring from her in every word. Dorothy, her eyes brimming with tears, wrapped her arms tightly around her daughter. "Oh, Susan, my dear, I'm so sorry for everything you've been through," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "But you're safe now. We're going to take care of you. We'll make sure everything is resolved. I promise," she said, her words not just a reassurance but a vow. She was no longer just a mother, she was a protector, ready to stand against anything for her child. An officer approached them, his demeanor respectful yet serious. "Ladies, I want you to know that Charles Moore has been arrested on several serious charges, including emotional abuse and neglect," he explained, his voice steady as he detailed the legal procedures that would follow. "Your testimonies, along with the evidence we've gathered, were crucial in allowing us to take this action. We will do everything we can to ensure Susan's safety moving forward." Helen listened to the officer's words, a complex mix of relief and sadness washing over her. She turned to Susan, her voice gentle but strong. "Susan, this means you won't have to go back to that house, to that life. We'll find a way to rebuild, to make sure you feel safe and loved again." She promised, her determination unwavering. In that moment, she knew that the long road ahead would be difficult, but together with Dorothy, with Susan, they would find a way to heal. Hugged by her mother and Helen, Susan allowed herself to finally feel a glimmer of hope. "Maybe now I can have the chance to just be me," she thought, as the idea of a fresh start free from the shadows of her past began to take shape in her mind. The warmth of the embrace, the promise of safety, and the relief of no longer living under constant pressure felt like the beginning of something new and beautiful. As the officer stepped away, Dorothy turned her attention to Helen, her eyes shining with gratitude and an idea forming. "Helen," she began, smiling warmly, "you lost your job because you did the right thing for Susan. But I was thinking, I'd love to experience someone else's cooking for a change. Would you consider working for me here at my house? I know Susan would love to have you around." Her voice was filled with sincerity, an invitation to become part of a new chapter in their lives. Helen, taken aback by the offer but deeply touched, couldn't help but smile broadly. "I would be honored," she replied, her heart swelling with joy. "Nothing would make me happier than to continue being part of Susan's life, and now yours too." The prospect of this new beginning, filled with warmth and love, was exactly what she needed after everything they had been through. Hearing the exchange, Susan's heart warmed at the thought of Helen staying in her life. "This is going to be amazing," she exclaimed, her voice full of excitement. "Helen makes the best cakes." For the first time in a long while, Susan felt genuine happiness, knowing that her new life would be filled with love and support. 2 months passed since that pivotal day at the police station, and life at Dorothy's house had transformed into a haven of peace and new beginnings. The dark days of Susan's past had been replaced with laughter, conversations, and a renewed sense of hope. The house, once quiet and filled with longing, was now a place of healing and joy. On a typical morning, the air was filled with the delicious aroma of breakfast, and the sounds of light-hearted chatter filled the kitchen. Susan sat at the table, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she shared her news. "Mom, Helen, I got a high grade on my essay about what is happiness," she announced, her enthusiasm contagious. "I wrote about finding happiness in the little things, like having my mom and Helen around." Dorothy beamed with pride, exchanging a knowing look with Helen. "That's wonderful, Susan," she said, her voice filled with love. "We're so proud of you. Seeing you happy is our greatest happiness. I love you so much, my daughter." Her heart was full, grateful for the harmony that now filled their home, a stark contrast to the darkness they had once known. Meanwhile, far away in a cold, isolated jail cell, Charles Moore sat brooding over his situation. His anger and resentment festered, growing with each passing day. "They'll see," he thought bitterly, his mind twisting with a desire for retribution. "They don't know what they've done," even as he faced many years behind bars. There was no remorse in his heart, only a burning anger at losing control of the life he had tried to shape. But back at Dorothy's house, life continued with a new rhythm, a rhythm of healing, love, and rebuilding. The scars of the past were slowly fading, replaced by moments of joy and connection. As Helen helped Susan with her homework one evening, she couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. "You know," she said, her voice soft with wonder, "I never imagined we could be so well after everything we went through." Susan looked up from her work and smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "It's because we have each other," she said simply. And in that moment, Helen knew that they had truly found their way to a brighter future, one where love, courage, and resilience would guide them forward. "And I never imagined I would have the chance to just be happy again," Susan said softly, her smile growing as she spoke. The words were full of emotion, reflecting the journey she had been on, from the darkest days of her life to this new chapter, filled with light and hope. "But here we are, me, my mom, and you, my best friend," she continued, her voice warm and sincere. The gratitude she felt for her new life was evident in her every word, and the constant presence of Dorothy and Helen had become her anchor, grounding her in a way she had never known before. This simple, heartfelt moment between them carried a depth that spoke of the bond they had built, one forged through hardship, love, and unwavering support. Susan looked around the cozy kitchen, now filled with the laughter and warmth that had once seemed so far out of reach. The days of feeling trapped and alone were behind her, replaced by a sense of belonging and safety she cherished deeply. Dorothy and Helen weren't just her mother and her friend, they were her family, and together they had created a new life, one where joy was no longer a fleeting dream, but a daily reality. As the weeks and months passed, the rhythm of their lives continued to unfold, woven together with the threads of love, healing, and shared moments. The house that had once been quiet and filled with longing now echoed with the sound of laughter, the smell of freshly baked cakes, and the warmth of shared meals. It had become a true home, a place where Susan could finally be herself, free from the burdens of the past. Each day was a new beginning, an opportunity to learn, to grow, and to heal. Dorothy, Helen, and Susan found themselves moving forward, step by step, as they created a life that was entirely their own. They spent their days together, talking, laughing, and supporting one another in ways that felt as natural as breathing. The simple joys like helping Susan with her schoolwork, cooking together, or enjoying quiet evenings by the fireplace became the foundation of their new reality. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful life, there was also a profound sense of justice. Though it had taken time, justice had finally come, bringing with it a sense of closure and peace that allowed them to truly move forward. Charles's influence, once so overpowering, had been removed from their lives, and the future that had once seemed so uncertain now stretched out before them, filled with possibilities. The journey they had taken together was a testament to the power of love and resilience, to the human capacity to rise above even the darkest of circumstances. Their story wasn't just about survival, it was about the strength that comes from finding hope in the most unlikely places, about the courage to rebuild, and about the enduring bonds that kept them moving forward. And so, amidst the laughter, the learning, and the quiet moments of reflection, Susan, Dorothy, and Helen continued their story, one of love, renewal, and the unwavering belief that, together, they could face anything life had to offer. The peace they had found wasn't just the absence of hardship, it was the presence of something much more powerful, the knowledge that they had each other, and that, in the end, that was all they really needed. Now that you've journeyed through this powerful story of resilience and love, what have you learned? Reflect on the challenges Susan faced and the strength she found in herself and others. Think about how this story resonates with your own life. What's one thing you've learned from Susan's journey that you'll bring to practice in your life? Please share it in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel.